Library, and we are delighted here at Erwin Center this evening to offer Telling Our Stories in honor of Gaston County's 150th birthday. It's now my pleasure also to introduce our Master of Ceremonies for the evening, Councilman Walker Reid, the City of Gastonia. Let's all welcome Walker Reid.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I am Walker Reid, a City of Gastonia councilman, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this special Erwin Center Branch Library program of Telling Our Stories in Gaston, an oral history project presenting local people from our own Gastonia and Highland communities sharing their own real-life stories from our Gaston County past. Telling Our Stories in Gaston, a 10-part public performance series featuring down-home folks and celebrating our greater Gaston history, heritage, community, and people. It's presented by the Gaston County Public Library as part of the Sesquicentennial celebration honoring the 150th anniversary of Gaston County's founding. Tonight's featured attractions includes, to my left and to your right, Mrs. Margaret Burris, Mrs. Peggy Ferguson, Mrs. May Adams Thomas, Mr. James Ferguson. To my right, to your left, Mr. Ernest Farr, Mrs. Franzola Moore, Mrs. Lillian Williams, and Mr. George Jaggers. This evening, as these volunteer yarn spinners share their family and personal stories, you will be able to glimpse what growing up, working, learning, living, and being a part of community life in the past was really like for all those who contributed to the growth of this county we call Gaston. We would like to thank all the individuals and groups who have generously contributed to the success of this event, including Erwin Recreation Center staff, City of Gastonia Recreation Department, Cultural History Enrichment Society, Walter Crank, Cassandra Beard, the numerous community volunteers who have helped to make this event possible, and also the Gaston County Public Library staff who are videotaping this event. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy a delightful evening of tales from some of Gaston County's best storytellers.
Because we had an extended community, everyone in the community took care of the children. I remember very, very distinctly going to the post office on Highland Street with my mother because that was sort of one of the places where we centered for recreation, going behind Tabernacle Church on York Street to the playground. We had a swimming pool at Tabernacle, but it had to be drained because the young man lost his life. But it was a lot of fun just being a child in the Highland community. Going to Highland School was a special treat. But before we went to Highland, we had a kindergarten. It was on, Lillian, what was the street?
It was on Norfolk Street at the old hospital, which is now the T.H. Williston Family Home. And that was the original hospital where Mrs. Wilson, Miss Pearl Wilson, was the director of nursing.
Do you remember any of the events or things that happened? Who was our teacher and that kind of thing?
Our teachers were Miss Nettie Edwards and Miss Nettie Jones and a Reverend Foster, I believe. He had the boys, and Miss Nettie Jones and Miss Nettie Edwards had the girls. We had, even way back then, a lady that was called an aide, and she still lives. She's a Mrs. Ovida McGill Glenn, okay, and we even have a picture that was taken of the kindergarten way back then. She supplied me with this picture. There are quite a few people on there that you know. I recognize Garnell Williams, and let's see, Leslie Lightner, and Aline Holland Ramseur, Doris Drummond, Gilbert Holland, Anjo Holland. And I shouldn't say this, but the thing that I remember most is we were getting ready to have kindergarten graduation at St. Paul Church on Oakland, and we couldn't have it because somebody had died. About the first thing I remember about anybody ever dying, and we couldn't have it because they had to have the funeral that day. But we left kindergarten, and when we tell people that we went to kindergarten way back in the 30s, people don't believe us, but we did. And
It's nice to have this.
yes, and we grew up in what we call very good times. When we started to school on what was called a swing shift. Part of us went to school from 8 to 12, and the others of us began at 12:30 and went till 4:30 in the afternoon. And that's because we did not have enough room to go to school. So first grades went on double shifts. This was prior to our having a gymnasium. The gymnasium came about the same time that we entered school. That was the first year. It seems like Mrs. Irvin and the PTA and what have you. Mrs. Irvin was the wife of Dr. H.J. Irvin, raised money to make people aware that we needed a gymnasium just like everybody else. And for a long time, all of our basketball games were played in Highland Gymnasium because no black school, they were called Negro schools at that time, had a gymnasium but Gastonia. And then when Gastonia got theirs, they built one in Cherryville and one in Belmont. And so all of the tournaments and stuff were played in Gastonia. And of course, we didn't know what basketball was about, but we were there cheering it on. Sometimes we cheered for the wrong team, didn't we, Peg? And do you remember where we played football?
Yes. I remember Old Ashley.
Yes.
We had to walk to Old Ashley. To the football game. Remember, what was that, 46 when we won?
When we won the state championship.
And we walked down to Ashley. We got out of school early and went to Ashley. But you know, the other thing, we didn't have a cafeteria either. Our parents fixed our lunch, or they gave us 15 cents or 20 cents, sometimes 25. And we would go and get a bowl of soup, and we'd go to Mr. Ed Odom's
Shoe shine ball.
yeah, and get the best hot dogs in town.
And a red round. A red round happened to have been a piece of bologna that was cooked in tomato sauce, ketchup, we call it now. Well, I used to get a dime a day, y'all. And out of my dime, I was able to get a cinnamon, well, I carried my lunch because I lived too far away from the school to walk home for lunch. But I'd get a cinnamon bun for a nickel, and it was divided into 3 parts, so I could share it. I ate 1 part, gave the other 2 parts away. And with the other nickel, I bought popcorn from Smokey Joe's Cafe. I believe Smokey Joe was Mr. Joe Workman. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay. But that was the best. That dime did everything.
So you lived too far to walk. Where did you live?
I lived too far. I lived on Pryor Street, and we went to school on York Street. We were able to get home, to go home for lunch if you lived close enough. But otherwise, you carried your lunch. And the milkman brought you milk and juice. If your parents paid for it, then you had your milk and juice. And you shared your lunch with everyone else so that everybody had something to eat.
But you know, we have a lot of Highland graduates. Joey, when did you come to Highland?
40. And we didn't have a cafeteria like you said. And if I didn't go out to Les Light and get a bowl of beans, it was less than 15 cents. It was more than you could eat. And when Mother gave me something extra, we had the freedom to go uptown too. So I'd go up to Crescent and get a bag of those cream cookies, and came back and in Pa Robinson's room was eating those things. He knew the old boy from Dallas was hungry. Some, and after a while he said, all right, little old boy from Dallas, I think you done had enough. Because he had that big mirror over there in the corner. And, but going back, I grew up in Dallas. And I can remember the 30s, although I was born before 1930, but I can remember the 30s. I can remember my grandfather talking about the Depression. And I lived at a school. Our property adjoined the Dallas High School and elementary. It was a union school then. The elementary and the high school were together. And I played ball out there all the time with all of the guys, the Fridays and the Clemmers and the Bill Friday's brothers. We all played out there. And I used to wonder why I couldn't go to school there, because we did everything else together. And as some of you have already stated, I was telling Mr. Reid, I'm a firm believer that none of us got to where we are without the helps of so many people. It's almost too many to name. But I have some I'd like to name. Other than my mother and dad and grandfather, Miss Sarah Costner was the first outside person I guess I came in contact with. And I'm talking about the Sarah Costner from Dallas, Mr. Lump Costner's daughter. She was my first grade teacher. And I had the privilege of working with her at Pleasant Ridge, which I considered an honor. But I think the guy that had the most influence on me was Reverend C.F. Jingles, who was our principal. And the other lady that made a real indelible bearing on my life was Miss Flora Adams. You got her geography. And you knew she loved you, but she could pinch your earlobe, and it would hurt a whole week. But you know, we knew Miss Adams and Miss Vine and them loved us. And Miss Louise Falls.
That wasn't child abuse, Mr. Italian. That wasn't child abuse.
I didn't understand.
That wasn't child abuse at that time. Pinching you.
Oh, yeah. And Miss Louise Falls, Miss Dora Alfred, and I told him, I said Miss Annie Reid, that's Mr. Reid's grandmother. His grandmother and grandfather, and his dad. His dad was one of my mentors, because I remember him singing with a group on the radio. I believe F.C. Todd owned that radio station or something, but Mr. Walker III's there's daddy used to sing with a group on the radio.
Did he sing with the Dixie
I thought that,
Rock?
I don't remember the name of the group, but I remember we used to listen to him on the radio. And my dad had a radio, and all the guys, Mr. Falls and Ralph Jingleman, would all come over to hear the fights, and we'd listen to Little Orphan Annie and Little Beaver and Red Rider and all that stuff like that. We'd listen to radio, and I liked radio because it helped us with our imagination, because you didn't see these things, but you could imagine as they told the stories. And I used to always want to listen to Let's Pretend on Saturday morning.
Yes.
And I always loved the Texaco. I'd listen to, later on, I'd listen to the Texaco program, because they would have operas and things on. And it just, everybody was my parents. That's why I kind of cringed when I heard those make fun of the lady saying that. It takes a village. It took a village to raise us. Because everywhere I went and as an adult, I knew I better act right, because they tell my daddy, you know, everybody knew everybody in Dallas at one time. And he'd already told us that if we said they didn't do it, then you calling those adults a lying, I'm going to be that much harder on them. But,
I'd like to break in here because I lived in a rural part of Gaston County. I came from like Landlow or Smithson's Mountain up here, but I had to ride the bus. And back in those days, they did have a bus when I was out there. But anyway, we'd get on the bus, but we were mistreated awfully on the bus. We had to get in the back seats, and we didn't understand that. And then they'd take us places where we didn't want to go, or we had to had spitballs and things thrown at us, you know. You hate to say that, but anyway, once we got into the city of Gaston, we had all the privileges that the people were having there. Because I came in the 8th grade, this 8th grade when I came, we had teachers that loved the children. And the parents and the children got along, the parents and the teachers got along. Like we were saying, we ate food, we brought our lunches, and we would share our lunches with the other children, because we had maybe ham biscuits when they had peanut butter sandwiches. And they thought our ham, we thought, oh, if they get a peanut butter sandwich, that's just great. So, but when they wanted that good old country ham, so we would exchange. And then we didn't have, we could not carry our lunches with us. There was a place called Mr. King's up on the corner. We would have a bowl of 10 pound biscuits. You could get that for 5 cents. So we stopped carrying our lunches because we could get it there. Candy man, he would come every Thursday and have the big bars and things so we could get candy for 5 cents. But then as time went on, we had a lady who served us, I can't remember the name right now, but anyway, when we were there, we would cook things in that place, you know, sometimes. And we got a chance to eat little things, you know, that we would cook. And if we were going to have a ball game, sometimes we would serve the ball players who were going to play out of what was it, Ashley? Yeah.
It was called Gastonia High School then.
So we had to walk, well, I don't know, we had to walk at night on the road to get to go to a game. And then sometimes maybe we had to stand in the back, or maybe we had to look through the wires because maybe we couldn't get in. So oftentimes they wouldn't let us go because we couldn't. But anyway, so it might have been, I don't remember his name right now. But anyway, he would have this candy. We'd all get candy every Thursday. So we look forward to getting that candy. But then getting back to our educational parts, we had some very, very good teachers and very strict teachers. And I thank God for the teachers that we had going to Highland School. I don't know how you all got along with yours. We had wonderful teachers. Mr. Dunn was one. Mr. Hamilton, if you all can remember those people. And the, what's the man, he married the girl there. What was it? I can't remember his name right now. Mr. Blair. Those are some of the teachers that we had there. And they were real good. Mr. Dunn was there. Mr. Humphrey, one of the Humphreys, I believe, from Dallas. I believe at that time they had Mr. Hamilton. Yes, that's who it was. That was her husband. But anyway, we got along like family. And our parents relied on what those teachers said because they knew the teachers were not going to do the thing wrong with those kids. But if something came up, they would go to your defense. I remember having a time once in the hall. We'd been to the gym, I believe, across the street, and this guy was picking after me, and Mr. Hamilton jumped up there and expelled me from school, sent me out of the school, and I hadn't done a thing. The boy grabbed me, just knew how you boys would do sometimes, and sent me out. But that night was PTA meeting, and can you imagine? I took my mom to PTA meeting that night. Oh boy. So when they got through with that, I was no longer suspended. And that's one thing I can remember of something good that happened to me where I didn't have much of a voice to say. But the man took the guy because he saw him mess with me, but I didn't do it. But anyway, that was one little thing happening in the hall. It was a long time ago we had those halls too. I don't know if you all remember. But anyway.
You know when I first remember you?
When?
You were in a pageant Christmas program. Miss Glasgow.
We sure did.
Miss Glasgow used to have a grand Christmas program every year.
We made our own dresses too.
Well, I don't know about that. But
We
you
made
were
that
in
down.
high school, and it depicted the life of Jesus. And of course, it started out with about 15 or 20 verses of "Oh, come on, be faithful," and everybody processed in. And you were either Mary or one of the angels.
I was an angel. I remember that.
Okay.
I was an angel.
And of course, at that time, she used about 3 or 4 of her little second or third grade students in. And
It was so pretty.
this is the first time I remember you.
Bless your heart.
And then I didn't see you anymore until I came back.
How about that?
Ms. Brooks, what
We
about
lived there because we had to have lessons. And a lot of times we get there in time to live in second class or third class. And I used to feel sort of embarrassed about that. Buses would break down.
Mhm.
Still in the cold.
We had to
We
rock it.
Dallas and
They gave us the ones that had been used and almost dilapidated. So we The blacks got the ones after they had finished with them. You know, they weren't so good.
You talked about the transportation. Was it the school system transportation from your home to Gastonia, or was
No, we walked to Ranlow up to a point, and then when we did start getting a bus, we got a city bus. We had to pay that bus. We had to pay to ride.
you had to pay to ride the city bus?
Yes, but what
to
happened?
Highland?
Yes, but the white children would pass us in a school bus, and they would throw out spitballs and call us or call our names to us. And we just had to take that, you know. That's some things that we grew up with. We didn't understand. We were children. We didn't understand that. You know, maybe you might say, well, I couldn't understand somebody throwing a rock or spitting out of the window on me. I wasn't used to that kind of stuff. But we had a big fight there one time, I tell you. One thing, I was a country girl, I could fight up a breeze. We had one of the notorious folks, I fought an old man. I beat him down to the ground. I hate to say that, but I did. That's history. I did it. I was a tough girl because I was a country girl. We had a farm.
Miss Rizzo, you went to Highland too, didn't you?
I started school in the first grade, and I never will forget, that's when they had school in the morning. Part of them went to school in the morning, another part in the afternoon. I got right out there on the York Street and cried like a little baby. Parents didn't give way to it, then Mama made it. And after that, I had the best time in school. And I started in the first grade, as I said, and the other group and my sister and those went at the other part of the day. So after meeting the other children, everything was all right. I think our principal was Mr. Rollins. Was it J.A. or A.J.? J.A. Rollins? Rollins. Mm-hmm. That was the principal then. I went to, I finished high school in '32. I went to Winston, spent 2 years and about 3 months. Came out and started to work. So my first job was at what they call Rankin Town, up there, and I think high shows. And sometime you go into winter. One morning I got to school, my hands were so cold on the steering wheel. See, cars didn't have all these heaters and things like you got now. When I got there, I couldn't get out of the car. And I often think about it. One morning got there and somebody broken into school and they had one of those long heaters. Somebody knocked the stovepipe down and all that rotten wood around there. We came there freezing that day. And I often think about it. I said, children have such a glorious time. I said, and you didn't stay out of school for everything. You had to go. So it was enjoyable. And here in Gastonia, the things we would look forward to would be when they'd have the fair and parades. I think that was our two, events we looked forward to. And then on the street they had what you call those trolley cars that ran right up and down the street. You remember? So it was enjoyable, and I appreciate it now. And I appreciate the teachers we had, because I often think about Miss Dulcina Spencer and Miss Flora Adams. Now, you had to get the lesson. Because Miss Spencer was the one started me to reading. She'd have a book over there, and then you better read. So I guess that's why my eyes are weak now, reading so much. But it was enjoyable.
Since you were speaking about how from 1900 to 1950, this is the whole history of during that particular time of the Highland.
That's it. Our lives back when I came up centered around two things, well, three things: the home, the school, and the church. When I was in high school, if you weren't at school, you had something in school one night, something at church the next night. You went to church twice a day, in the summer you went to everybody's Bible school. You went to your own, and you went to everybody else's, and it was just. Well, we might have been poor and what have you, but we had no idea that we were. We had a real enjoyable youth. We did lots of things. We had lots of house parties. That was the time when you could have a party, you could invite people, they came, you rolled up the rug, you danced and what have you, and you just had a really good time. But, oh, playing post office. Okay. Miss Renzola, you didn't tell us about your mom. Because I remember that my daddy worked in the barbershop next door.
Well, to tell you the truth, I think Mama and Papa went across that block. Because they first started at the cafe. That's over there where a little club. They worked in there. Then Papa came on over to the pool room, ran the pool room, and from that to the drugstore. And that, then we moved on the other side of the road. That's where it ended, because that's, he passed. But I don't know, it was enjoyable, because like on Sunday evening, there were girls and boys would come by, and eat ice cream and everything. We couldn't go many places. And I would see girls and boys going down, I reckon it's Long Creek or somewhere, and I want to walk so bad, but when you came home from church, you got out of those clothes and got back down in the yard and played. It wasn't like it is now. I said maybe if we do a little more of that, we'd be better.
Not having any types of recreation, so to speak. You're talking about a swimming pool or things like that. They were just out of the questions. Basketball goals to go out and shoot and have fun. We swimming, we dammed up the branch down there and we swam in the branch. And I have never heard of anyone getting sick from swimming in that branch. That water was being disposed from an old ice airline. Never heard of anyone taking sick. I can remember the days and when all of us and many of us, we would walk the railroad track going to Dallas in that direction. And generally we were barefooted. And the real rugged times, I stuck a nail in my foot many days and just reached down and pulled it out and went on about my business. But oh my, let it happen now. You better rush you to the hospital and get a tetanus shot. So it was quite different. And it's marvelous how we came through those times to entertain. No radios, no television. We had the newspaper, magazines. I didn't know what those were in my house. No, I didn't know what those were in my house. We just lived practically off nothing. And even make the situation even worse, to give us more credit, how we survived the period that we came up to. We went to inferior schools, as all of us recognize that. And you had the bus, but I walked to all of my schools.
So we walked up longer than Ranlow.
I walked. Talking about someone picking you up and giving you a ride? No. That just didn't occur in my day.
What section did you live in?
Well, it wasn't too far. I lived where the home place is now, and I walked over to Highland, it wasn't too far, but we walked. In the snow. And the snow. Rain.
One time, though, you lived in the West End, Brooks, because you all lived right on the corner. And there was a pond behind the house, and they had these water plants. What you call those things? Cattails would go in there. And we would go down in there, because I remember going down in there once or twice. Well, any number of times, but this particular time, my feet got stuck up in the mud.
You were going to see Mr. Brooks?
No, it was just bad. But in the meantime, my father had a little old store, and he called it the Shack. And my mother would give me a nickel or apple, and she said, now, you go downtown to the Gaston Federal, And I had a Christmas saving club, and it was 5 cents. But I couldn't count. She just gave me some pennies, and I'd go there. And I was so short and so small until the lady in there, but over there, at that time, the office was just about the size of that portion of the rug there. And she would come out from her little booth, come out there and get my nickel or pennies or whatever it was, and go back and mark my book. And at Christmas time, I'd get my Christmas saving club, and it would be 35 or 40 cents, $40. And I thought I was wealthy. I just thought I was the richest thing with that money. And I would go, she would say, now, here's an apple in your right hand, and here's a nickel in your left hand. Now you go directly to the bank and come back and don't stop. And if you see any little boys and they say, can I buy you a hot dog? You tell them no. She said, don't accept anything from those boys. And I would go, come on back, and I'd have my little book and everything that the lady had marked for me. And she had a long hat pin, about that long. All elderly ladies wore them. And I would put that hat pin in my arm like this, and I'd walk along. And when some of the kids would come by, I'd have an apple or candy or something. They'd say, give me some of it. And I was small. And I said, no, if they try to take it out, stick them with that hat pin. I'm telling you the truth. But that's the way that I came along, and it has followed me down through the years. I've always wanted to be a part of business, some business. And as long as I can remember, all my life, I have worked very close with someone who had a business but let me be a part of it, or I've had my own. So I'm very, very thankful that I listened to her. I thought I had the meanest mother in the world, because she would tell me, don't be out there playing with those little boys. If you're going to shoot marbles, shoot by yourself.
Miss Ray just talked about the savings and the Gastonia Federal and what have you. But how many of you remember when Mr. Nathaniel Barber first started the Excelsior Credit Union, and he used to come from house to house and collect, and this is how they started. This is how they started the credit union. They started it by going from house to house, and people paid so much money until they were able to get a charter. And this started like and of course, that credit union built many of our houses and educated many of us, because a lot of us would have never gotten to college had it not been for us saving that quarter a week, as some of us did. We wouldn't have been able to, because at that time we could not go to the banks and borrow money.
But you know, we talked about the time. But one of the things that our parents instilled in us was education. And you look at the number of students from Highland, starting with Mr. Brooks and Miss Frenzola, Mr. Métis, Mr. Farr. Years ago, it was important to get an education. And so we all went to college. I remember in my class of 77 students who graduated from Highland, over 50% of those students went to somebody's college. And so that has been a tradition in the Highland community, that you bettered yourself, that you got an education, whether it was a 2-year or 1 year, but your parents worked hard at making sure that you went to a college. We had a good social life in terms of, as Lillian pointed out, the things that the Highland community realized the political part that we must play if we're going to make a difference. And so you had the Nathaniel Barber, who was the first city councilman in Gastonia that represented the African American community. And then we had many others. J.Q. Falls, who was my cousin's husband, was our second city councilman. And Mr. Barber was, I don't know if we've had another city treasurer beside him that was African American. But,
One in Dallas.
Yes, but I'm talking about the first. He was probably the first, don't you think?
And he was the first in the state.
Yeah, yeah.
First in Dallas,
Yeah. And then after JQ, we had Mr. Jeffers and then Mr. Brooks, both Brookses. So we've had a line of people becoming involved in the political arena. And back during those days, Métis, you remember how you all used to register? Go from house to neighborhood to neighborhood. You had your precinct chairmans, and you had the women's club that made sure, because my mother was very, very strong in getting people out to vote back in the 50s. So we work hard as a people, but we realized that we had to become politically involved so that our children would have some of the things that life should afford.
And a part of that, A.M. Haston, prior to Mr. Barber becoming the city councilman, Mr. A.M. Haston was what we called an alderman. And this was in the late 40s. He was an alderman, and then he was a magistrate. Yes, but he was both of those. He was both of them.
It was my mother and your mother.
Since we're mentioning the political process, I did a little bit of back-checking on the political process. Let me run through.
Mr. Brooks.
Yes, sir.
Since you were talking about how, let me ask this question.
Okay.
Since you had Highland, you speak about Highland a few minutes ago. Peggy, can you tell us how many PhDs, MDs that have graduated from Highland? Because I understand there is a large number of students who throughout the country that PhDs have graduated from Highland.
Quite a few of them. I'll tell you what the reputation of Highland was in the 50s. If you graduated from Highland, you almost didn't have to take a placement test to go anywhere, because everyone said Highland students were ready. Of course, you walked in and you were ready.
But you know, the interesting thing, when I went to North Carolina Central in 1952, and at that time we had, well, still do, kids from all over the country, I was the only one who knew how to use a slide rule because of Moses Blair. Because of Moses Blair and what he taught us in basic math and in physics, we knew how to use a slide rule.
Advanced math.
And
even though our books were books that he had picked up when he was in service,
right,
our textbooks were, senior math was a book that had been used for them to do missiles and what have you in service. This was the textbook that we used, and of course we had a ball with it. We were kids that went to school during the day, and we would stay late in the afternoon to make sure we completed a chemistry book and did all of the experiments.
That's right.
Would stay after school. But we had a ball to go to school with.
I raised that question because you're talking about the history of Highland, and I think that should be known to the Gastonia, to the Gaston County community, the number of PhDs coming out of one small school, who at the earlier someone made a statement that was handicapped to a point, but it wasn't handicapped. So I think somebody should find that out and bring that up again.
But you know, ratio and proportionally speaking, I would say that there were more PhDs and MDs that came out of Highland than out of Ashley. Ratio and proportion, when you think about the number of students at Highland versus, but to give you the exact number, at one time we would say 10, and then I remember, but I can give you, it's more than that, but I can remember it when you think of the number, you start with Catherine Caldwell and you just go on and on naming the people with PhDs who graduated from Highland or who became, and they didn't come back to. The other thing that you've got to know is that a lot of the young people who went on to college or did whatever they wanted in terms of career, who would have probably, if they had stayed in Gastonia, Highland Community would look totally different but they couldn't because of the opportunities were not here. So they left because you remember in textiles, our parents couldn't work in textiles. Our parents didn't start working in textiles till in the late 50s.
60s.
Was it 60s?
Yes.
Because they couldn't work. They found other kinds of work. But whatever they found, one of the things that they made sure was that their children went to college. And they sent them. And we graduated on time.
When I first
Linda, you
started
want to
working in an integrated situation, it was very interesting that most of the parents had not been any further than the 7th grade. This did not happen in the black community. We went to school because we didn't make it any further if we didn't go to school. They had jobs that they could go into in the 7th grade and 8th grade, but we knew nothing about it.
Okay, can we get Mr. Brooks to give us a political history, and then I want Mr. Farr to end up talking about education, and we talked about all the heritage in the community. But Mr. Farr, I think if you end up with the religious background in the Highland community and throughout Gaston County, I think that would be a good topic to end this up on. So, Mr. Brooks, if you will, go ahead.
Is it possible that I can say something before we end it?
You don't mean this is not going to end the discussion, I know?
No.
Okay.
No. Go ahead, Mr. Brooks.
All right, thank you. This community became awakened to the importance of political action in the early 40s. We began to hear about black African Americans being elected to different councils over the nation. So locally, Nathaniel Barber, as it has already been mentioned, was our first council, elected in 1953 and served until 1959. He was the city treasurer, the first in the entire United States, black treasurer, and as mentioned, he found the Excelsior Credit Union in 1942. Our second city councilman, James Q. Falls, 1959 to 64. Theobald Jeffers, 1964 to 73, and he later became the mayor and served several years. W.B. Brooks followed T. Jeffers, 1976 until 1980, and then he has a split service. He came back in 85 to 89. Then I followed W.B. Brooks from 80 to 85, a split session again, came back in 92 to 95. Those were the people in this area in city government. However, we had other elected people serving the community. Mrs. Marie Hamilton served on the school board for 16 years, from 77 to 93. R.O. Mason is presently serving. He was appointed to succeed Mrs. Hamilton, and he is serving to the present time. Walter Davis in Belmont served 7 years on the Belmont City Council. In fact, he was the first African American to serve in that capacity. Anna Craig served one term. She followed Walter Davis. And Elsie Greer was elected in 85, and she's presently serving a total of 11 years to date. She also serves presently as Mayor Pro Tem. George W. Jagger, sitting over there. George H. I'm sorry. On the Dallas City Council, and he served from 77 to 95, 18 years. And he also served as Mayor Pro Tem at the time when he decided against re-election. William Edwards, Cherville. He was in the school system there. He served from 82 to 94 in Cherville. And Ted Williams served in Bessemer City 2 terms. David Smith served in Bessemer City on the council for 2 terms. Well, he was in his 3rd term when he died. Kay McCarthan, she serves now on the Bessemer City Council. In Lowell, we have Reverend Thomas Gillespie. He has served 4 terms, and he's still serving. We have Reverend Walter Adams, who serves the council in Randlow. He is presently serving. He was elected in 1994. Now, we have other people who have been elected to positions in the legal service. D.E. Ramsey, judge, 4 years. Kevin Hamrick, district attorney, 4 years. Rav C. Jingles, district judge, who presently serves, and he is in his third year. And down to the last, we have our present city council, Walker Reid, who is serving presently on the council. This
public defender.
Kevin Hamrick.
No, public defender.
Curtis
Harris.
Yeah.
I left him off. Thank you. Curtis Harris was elected as public defender and served at least 2 terms, didn't he? So that's a little bit of rundown of those who have been elected to serve in a public capacity in the political, in one way or another.
Is there Mr. Patterson from Randlow who served at least 2 terms on the 3 terms on the city council?
And I want that the NAACP was founded by her mother and my mother.
Okay.
This child and my mother was the NAACP. And the Gaston Boys Club was founded by my mother and Earl Ramsey.
Mr. Barnes.
I think they want you to say something about the religious aspect of the time.
Well, I'd like to make some comments. I'm really interested in what you all have said, and it means a lot. But what I have in my mind is entirely different from what you all. I was born May the 2nd, 1912. I'm looking at 85. And I've been here quite a while longer than a lot of you here. I remember when the only paved street in Gastonia was half a main street. Plus the fact that where you call Highland, right where I was born, right down there, that was the end of it. Wasn't nothing over on Caldwell, nothing over here, nothing else. Pryor Street, Pryor Town. Way back in those days. But the thing that I enjoy doing now and can appreciate is entirely different from what you all have been talking about. I'm going to make a statement, and I imagine quite a lot of you might not agree with me, but I have become convinced at this age that not one of us is responsible for how he got you or she got you. It's what you do while you're here that means a lot. And the thing that has helped me most of all in my life is I can, but I owe every bit of it to the training what I got here in Gastonia. And when you talk about music and church, Miss Gastonia Spencer is still over right there, out there. If it had not been for Mrs. Gastonia Spencer and others around here who trained me in music and stuff, I would have never have made it with Hall Johnson Choir. Rose Smith was the first one who introduced me to Hall Johnson in Charlotte, years before I even knew anything about it. And when I graduated from Lincoln Academy, after so long a time, because you all don't know nothing about that anyhow, I know now that our class motto was, "Before us lies the timber, let us build." I've been building ever since. I ain't got no way yet. But I do want to say this. It was difficult. But there are some things that I have learned and earned in the hard way that have been a lot to me. I never got through college. I had to drop out of Livingston College. I had 1 year there. And I was disappointed it got me. I never will forget. It was 1930, and I was going to determine I was going to go on to school or something else like that. But there's one man in particular who is responsible for me being where I am now. Fade Adams, A&B Shoe Shop. When he first opened that shop up there, I walked by there and I had never known it done about it. But I was complaining about the fact I couldn't go back to school. And he looked at me. I can appreciate what he said then. From, where is it? It was down in South Carolina, where he was born. But he said, I have a 6th grade education. But some friend of his and somebody came in and taught him the shoe repair. I'll tell you one thing. If you will come in here and work with me, I'll teach you everything I know about shoe repairing, machinery, and all of it. He did. I worked with him from 1930 until 1943 when Johnson and I got married and went to New York. Started off $12 a week. But it was good money. But he taught me how to repair machinery, not only shoes, repair machinery, all of this other stuff. And when Johnson and I married in 1943 and got to New York to get our fortune, he didn't stay here. We took off. That was during the war. And when they were grabbing everybody, going over to fight and all. My brother, who was 4 years older than I, they grabbed him in December. In December of the year before they grabbed him, I wound up down to Fort Bragg. But I was rejected because of the fact I was underweight. In May of the next year, they grabbed my brother, took him and everybody else, because it was after the Germans were after him and everybody else. Anyhow, I said, oh, Lord, I guess I'll be next. 1 week later, they passed a law. Those over 30, they won't grab me. They miss me. They missed me just that much, 1 week after they got my brother. But yet, in 1943, he's over in Indochina, and I'm in New York trying to get a job. And now you had all your jobs, the fussing and fighting and everything else. And what happened, but I landed in the top from there, I couldn't get out of the job. I was frozen in. German, Spanish, Italian, everything, the only black in the whole place for 4 years more. And those guys who know that kind of stuff, trades and everything else. So when you talk about religion, back to that. When somebody says you hear something about the way they were raised, right? When the church door opened, you were supposed to be there. Here at home, my parents. I don't care what prayer meeting or whatever it is, but you had to go. That was the kind of thing. Then when I first started work at the orthopedic hospital here in Gastonia. And then found out to keep that job Sunday. I tried for 1 year, and that was when I told them what to do with the job when I met Faye Dallas. Because I missed it. Everything else. I have never in my life accepted a job since that time that I had to work on Sundays. The same thing happened in New York City. I sang with the largest choirs in New York because the experience and the training that Dulcina Spencer and so many of these other down there had given me years ago. I love music. I always have. But when I got in there and I found into New York, I found that in these choirs, so many of the members were starving by God, trying to make up, get up and sing and everything else. I kept my trade. I kept working with shoes and everything else. But at the same time, when the war ended, I worked for the post office. They had frozen me in there till I could finish. And here, working in the union in New York, they changed to meetings on Sunday at 11 o'clock. I refused. That's when I switched over to the government and started working for the mental hospital with mental patients in New York, in Peekskill, New York, up in there. And we wound up in all of that. So religion and the music. Yet from those, in the churches and everywhere else, the first black to become a specialist in New York City opera was based on the choir with me. Most of the choir members were in all of those rehearsals, all those stories downtown on these places, and trying their best to get a place in. I know most of you have heard of Robert Mcferrin. His father and mother were on the same choir as I in New York, right there. We're all trained about it. They've separated since that time. But this one man who was the bass, the tenor, oh Lord, I can't even, Josh, what's his name? Anyhow, he became the first black to sing in the opera in New York. Bob Mcferrin was the first black to finish in Washington in the opera. That's the father of the Mcferrin that you see running around here now, not like that. Those are things that I have learned, and have to thank my training, how I was raised here in Gastonia. And I just want to say one or two other little things. I'm going to let it go. See, only you are responsible for what you do while here on earth. You are not responsible for how you got here. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he gets older, he will not depart from it. So these are the things that I have learned. And as I said, I've never worked on a job in my life that I had to work on Sunday. I gave up the job for the union Sunday. And my musical training and all, and these things and I went over to for the first time. Everybody had been telling me she's out there at the hospital, next to the hospital. I couldn't even find her. And I found out it's behind all that place over there, and I walked in the door. And she, oh, Ernest, oh, my heart just went all out. I said, God bless you. That woman gave me all I needed in music and anything else. I'm not even worried about anything else. And I just wanted to read it the other morning, just want to read you a portion of this. If we read today's narrative in its literal context, we are told that all the nations will be gathered before him. Surely, somewhere, sometime, there must be a corporate accountability. Someone has remarked, since the day God handed everything over to us, the world has been going to hell on a bobsled. God gave us control. And what have we done with it? Everything that pertains to planet Earth, from ozone layers, South American rainforests, whales, elephants, oil spills, radiation, fallout, and on, science and space has become littered with junk to the point of creating hazards for space travel, high-tech pollution. We must not blame God for the mess we have brought on ourselves. We, the inhabitants of the world, have abused the privilege bequeathed to us, allowing greed, selfishness, and cruelty to take over. There's hope, God said. If my people who are called by my name humble themselves, pray, seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will forgive their sin and heal their land. It's up to us. To nobody else but you.
Hey, Cousin Ernest.
Yes, ma'am.
Tell them how Highland got their first band. Tell them, we're telling our story. Tell them how Highland got its first band. Do you know?
No.
Oh.
I might not have been here. You know, when Highland, I had to leave Highland because Highland was only 10th grade. Never got up to that. You could graduate at Lincoln Academy and teach in South Carolina, but you couldn't do it here in Gastonia. Graduate. That's the reason why we all had to go out to Lincoln Academy. Some of us, my brother and Ruth Adams and several others, we went to Lincoln Academy, and some went to Bennett College, Johnson C. Smith, were given high school studies back in those days. Okay. That's the reason why I had to graduate from Lincoln Academy.
Well, the band began in the 40s, and it began because, as I understand it, somewhere along the line, every person took music of some sort. And there were men who had instruments and what have you. Mr. R.L. Schooler, who later became principal of Highland, began the band, but he began the band with instruments that were donated by people like Bus Pryor and Mr. J.B. Adams, Mr. Rob Davis.
My mother.
Your mother had an instrument too? Okay, and anyway, these people donated tubas and saxophones and clarinets, and this is how the first bands were formed. And of course, as I understand it, at some period in time, everybody made sure that their children took music. This we are losing now, and we need to get it again.
If you remember, your father played the piano.
Yes.
And Barber was drummer, and that was on my piano in my home.
Okay. Well, see, I don't know because
I know because Mr. Pryor said, boys here and rehearse on your piano, I'll give your daughter her music lessons free.
Okay.
That's right.
I'd like to tell you one other thing before we forget. Some of you mentioned Reverend Rollins about being the first principal here in Highland. That's a hold it out in my hand. This is something else I have never forgotten. When Reverend Rollins became principal, of course, as I said, it was the 10th grade when I left out. But way back, just as we started in high school, 7th or 8th grade, whatever it was, 4 or 5 of me and my friends, boys, got together, and we were going up to see Jesse James under the black flag at the theater up on up on Main Street. So we were good students, best families, good families, all that kind of came from that ice. But we were going to sneak off. And Highland at that time, the same old building right over here standing there now. Reverend Rollins was upstairs on the second floor, and we hadn't paid any attention to him. We didn't know he was up there. And you told about that creek down there and all that. Man, you don't know nothing about that creek. We sneaked out, that's where we went on the creek and went right on up to the little theater.
Remember, he was the second.
Let me tell you what happened. All of us from good families, the best families in Gastonia. I'm not going to call their names anyway else. Most of them are dead. Joseph Miller was one of them. But anyhow, the next day, we got laid out from school for a solid week. Didn't care if you was Farr, Robinson, Pryor, whoever it was. And you had to stay. You had to stay out. You had to pay for it. But they don't do that these days. They were tough on you back in those days. They didn't have no food. If you got a whipping in school, you got another when you came home. No questions asked. You had no business. Like your parents, the school, the church, all of it. Here at my church, right across the street, and God knows, ever since they torn it, I've been ready to cry. Ever since they tore my church, because they destroyed my life. That's all I've been out there. But Mrs. Ferguson and all the rest of them, if you were in the school, in the church, Monday morning you're going to be over here in Highland, in school. And then, what else could you do? These are the same ones who were trained. And if you did anything wrong, your parents, you didn't need no telephone. Your parents knew everything. There wasn't no telephone back in those days. But I guarantee if you got a licking in school, you got another when you came home. This is training and stuff like that. The kids ought to have it. And when you talk about this other stuff, I wouldn't want to argue about it now, but they're arguing about sexuality, this, that, and the other. One of the best known women in the black neighborhood, if you never knew, was Pearl Ryan. And there was never a funeral that passed. Bring Reid. But nobody said anything about what the relationship was or with anybody else. But it was one of the best things. And Jim, who started the Scout, that King Brown and all that kind of, these people, and I'm not saying, don't get to the fact that you have to have a degree. It doesn't mean a darn thing unless you use it. Nothing else. You've got to use everything. It doesn't mean a complicated thing. If you have worked with 2,000 mental patients in prisons who had all kinds of degrees and everything else and been trained in them, one of them, that's another thing I'm sorry, I didn't mean to take up that much time. But when I left the post office in New York and got my certificate from the University of New York to become the first head of trade school in New York City. We opened it up in Brooklyn and in Manhattan. We had over 100 students per session in that school, and I had to run between those two. That's how I got the job with the VA up in upper state New York. In Harlem, our school floor was right up over a saloon, and we couldn't keep the students out of that saloon at the time. All they wanted to do, they came back here, the veterans came back here to get that check, to get that money. And the first time I turned at this VA hospital in Montrose, New York, I was the first black to be over that section, and we taught all trades there. Who should walk in for one of the same guys that we had there? And I said, you dirty fool, I tried to keep you out of it. There's a lot of things that you can learn. I'm sorry.
I was thinking of something that Mr. Farr said. As a poem, sister has her master's, brother his PhD, but Dad's the only one in the house with a J.O.B.
Yes.
And Miss Ferguson started off about the 30s. Most of us, excuse me, I had to clear up my throat, was born before the 30s. If you were, it's a little something I put together here. We were born before plastic, penicillin, before television, before polio shots, Xerox, frozen food, contact lens, the pills, frisbees. We were before ballpoint pens, credit cards, split atoms, radar, laser beams, before pantyhose, drip dry clothes, air conditioners, clothes dryers, electric blankets, dishwashers, before man walked on the moon.
Yes.
We got married first and then lived together.
Amen.
In our time, closets were for clothes, not for coming out of. Bunnies were small rabbits, and rabbits were not Volkswagens. Designer jeans were scheming girls named Jean or Jean Ann. And having a meaningful relationship meant getting along with your cousins. Fast foods was what you ate during Lent. Outer space was the balcony at the Lyric Theater. We were before gay rights, house husbands, computer dating, dual careers, computer marriages. We were before daycare centers, group therapy, nursing homes, also chemo. We never heard of FM radios, stereo, tape decks, yogurt, electric typewriters, word processors, artificial wearing earrings. For us, time sharing meant togetherness, not computers or condominiums. A chip meant a piece of wood because we used to have to cut wood. Hardware meant hardware, and software wasn't even a word. In 1940, made in Japan meant junk, and the term making out referred to how you did on your exams. Pizzas, McDonald's, and instant coffee were unheard of. We were on the scene, excuse me, when there were 5 and 10 cent stores where you bought things for 5 or 10 cents. Tony and Ed Odom sold ice cream cones for a nickel or a dime. For 1 nickel, you could make a phone call, buy a Pepsi, or a stamp and 2 postal cards. You could buy a new car for $600, but who in the world could afford it? Gasoline was 10 cents a gallon. Cigarette smoking was fashionable. Grass was mowed. Coke was a cold drink. Pot was something that you cooked in.
Right.
Rock music was grandmother's lullaby. And aides were the helpers in the principal's office. We were certainly not before the difference between the sexes was discovered, but we surely were before the sex change. We made do with what we had, and we were the last generation that was so dumb as to think you needed a husband to have a baby. No wonder we are so confused, and there's a generation gap today, but we survived. We survived. And to top it off, we've been talking about life, and to me, life was made for living and giving and sharing and knowing and showing and daring and caring. Life's made for doing, pursuing of dreams, sowing and growing whatever the means, revealing and feeling and finding that you must learn how to take it to make it come true. Along with its ups, in spite of its downs, life's made of losses and crosses and crowns. Thank you.
Along with what Mr. Jagger said to Mr. Fox,
Your feet up a little bit.
I think it'd be good if we may get that picture of something from Miss Delphine, especially since she's probably the oldest one of the old. she was celebrating her 97th birthday back this summer. It was in August, I believe it was. She celebrated her 97th birthday, and she's still living.
You know, one of the other things I'd like to do before we disband is to sort of come to the 60s and look at when you think about, since we're telling our story, how our recreation started out. We had very little. We did have a playground here and there. I remember the youth center on York Street with Mama B. And then we have now this splendid building, Erwin Community Center. And Mr. Ferguson, why don't you tell us and give us some history of recreation again?
Well, I was going to say a couple other things. First, I am not a Gastonian, and I'm a transplant. And so some of the things that you're talking about, I was able to secure the history of it. I'm a collector, and I've collected a lot of history about Gastonia because I have it here on the floor. I have the history of Highland School, and we have the history of I have history of the recreation, how it was started in Gastonia. I gave Councilman Reid a copy of it. I think Ms. Ferguson mentioned earlier about the swimming pool below Tabernacle Church was built by black hands. And I think your daddy
gave the land.
Not only that, he did a lot of work, and your uncle. In fact, your uncle did most of the present pool. He helped dig that out by hand. He lived across the street from the pool. Pick and shovel, and the whipper, and they hauled the dirt out. So recreation has been here for a long time in Gastonia, probably longer than it has been in a lot of communities. Reverend Burke was the pastor ex-Councilman Brooks' pastor in the early years, and he and his wife started recreation in Gastonia, and it filtered over into Mr. Dunn, and then Mama B came along with Mr. Dunn, and from there they moved from York Street over to a little building down the back of, at the end of the street. That building was the tool house for the graveyard, and they took it and made it out of a one-room recreational building with one ping pong table, 4 card tables, and that was it. So everybody played cards, played ping pong, and had the best time. They had one little area for a concession stand. When I came to Gastonia in 1960, they made it back. That time I brought a picture of the board of directors and the credit committee of the Excelsior Credit Union. And from most of these members on here were made up a group they called the Recreation Advisory Committee, Urban Park Committee. Now they call it the Recreation Advisory Committee, but it stemmed from this one committee here. So blacks were pioneers in putting the recreation department together in Gastonia. And on that committee, on this list here, was Jim Falls was the chairman. There was Nathaniel Barber was a member. Smith, N.A. Smith, Ramseur, R.O. Mason, Charles Carson Jr. I believe that was it. That was on that committee, the Recreation Advisory Committee, during that time. I moved here in 1960, and fortunate enough to say they decided to give me a job, po boy. In 1961, we moved into the L-shaped building. Here's a picture of the dedication to the building. This was in October 1, 1960. The building cost $35,000. That's a lot of money, 1961. At that time, Councilman Reid and Mr. Crank all the little ones here, they were my little ones at that time. Mr. Reid, I'm not sure, were you born during those years? You born in 61? I was born in 57. Okay, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. So, in 1967, we added the present building where you set it now. October 1, 1967, we dedicated this part of the building. And we went into this building here. It was started in 1988, and we moved into it in 1990. We moved in 1990, wasn't it? We moved in, yeah. 1990. But the swimming pool was built in 1953 when the swimming pool opened. 1953, the summer of '53. My wife happened to be one of the pool at that time. Also, one of the workers at the pool during those years is our only general in the service was working there during that time. Horace Russell. He's in New York and Washington now living. So we have quite a bit of history in Gastonia, and I consider myself to be a Gastonian because I'm married to a Gastonian and I've lived here for all these many years. But there's a lot of good history that has been told. And Councilman Reid, I have a lot of information that you probably may want to look through and go over in the near future with some other stuff.
The ballpark itself, all of this was always a ballpark. The area from the time I was like this was always called the Ball Diamond. Okay, but the Ball Diamond, as you know it, Urban Park right here, was dedicated in 1949, just in time for us to play the Washington Blues for state championship again, and we lost the game 3-0.
Well, along with what she's saying, from what I understand, the ballpark was, at one time, was on the corner of Norwood and Mars Street. That was home plate. Huh? You didn't know that. That was home plate up there. That was where the first ballpark was. That was many years ago.
No,
that was before your time.
This was a red hill. I mean, that was a red, out there where there's grass now, it was just a red hill.
In closing, as a summary, I would just like to say, I want to recognize Mr. Glendale Brooks, who came in after we made the initial introductions. And during my opening remarks, I sort of mispronounced a word that I like to correct, and that's Sesquicentennial. The way that word is supposed to be pronounced. Born in 1957, sitting before me, I have educators, I have neighbors, I have community role models, I have recreational leaders. And I want to take the time personally now to let each one of you know what you have done for me, for members of my family, and most of all for members of this community. I think this event that took place tonight was well worth the time and the money that has gone into this. I would love to one day sit down with my kids, hopefully one day my grandkids, and share this video, giving them the history behind the Highland community, that they may pick up the torch and continue to carry it on and be the examples for the community, that none of you will be ashamed of what we have done and what we are doing to keep the reputation, history, and the heritage within the Highland community. I'd like to thank again all in making this a success. Thank you very much.